Hi all, welcome back to the studio, the War Office, however you want to think about this place. What I want to talk about over a series of videos, podcasts probably as well, is this issue about the missing few, as I call them. And I dare say that some people, perhaps not those who are keyed into the aviation history interest, ordinary, if you like, members of the public, would probably be astonished to learn about the Battle of Britain pilots that are still buried with the wreckage of their aircraft, and that nothing is being done about this. Astonishing. I've always personally been vexed by the issue of the missing. I remember my great-grandfather, my maternal grandfather, Herbert Smith, was 4th Battalion Worcestershire Regiment at Gallipoli and reported missing in July 1915. And I remember his photograph above my great-grandmother's fireplace and asking who he was. And I must have been very young because she died when I was 5. And it was, oh, it's your great-grandfather. Oh, well, where is he? Well, he was killed in the war. Well, what happened to him? Well, we don't know. He's missing. Well, how can you be missing? Well, of course, you can be missing, can't you? And there are still millions missing from the Second World War globally. And there's some extraordinary things being done about it. When the Eastern Front was opened up, Russia jumped on it, recovering Red Army war dead. Since the Iron Curtain fell down, the Germans have had access to the Eastern Front. They're recovering. I think the last figures I saw was something like 30 to 40,000 remains a year. And the Americans are extremely proactive all over conflict, theatres of conflict that the United States has fought in. And the Netherlands are absolutely exemplary. I mean, my friend Captain Jonker and the Recovery and Identification Unit based at Sosterberg, they're absolutely fantastic. Really wonderful work there, proactively seeking out the fallen, the missing, which the Dutch believe is a debt of honour. Unfortunately, this is not the case in this country. Now, how has all this sort of come into the spotlight? That's the interesting thing. Now, it's all about what's called aviation archaeology. And this was another sort of interest that span off from the Battle of Britain film, which came out in 1969, which is responsible for the Warburg restoration movement, really, and much else besides. And it inspired people. It inspired a whole new generation, a whole new wave of interest in the summer and autumn of 1940. And of course, the battlefield, as it really was, you know, is sort of Essex, Kent, Sussex, Hampshire, Dorset mainly. And what was happening was enthusiasts were going out into the countryside, and bearing in mind that at this time, sort of say about 1970, the RAF records that we have access to today at the National Archives were still secret. They weren't released until 1975. So there wasn't a lot to go on. And such was the proliferation of crashes in southern England that very often the enthusiasts didn't know even the type of aircraft that they were looking at. They would go to a village or whatever, seek out elderly residents, inquire as to whether there were any crashed aircraft from the Battle of Britain in the area, and they'd be pointed in the right direction. And sometimes they think they were looking for a Spitfire, but they find Hurricane, or vice versa, or a German aircraft. And this was all new stuff. And why were they doing this? Well, these are very tangible links to the past, aren't they? These great chunks of aircraft, engines, propellers, machine guns, cockpit parts, particularly control columns and things like that, which give you a direct link to the pilot and the story. And there was a movement, a whole wave of voluntary run small museums across southern England, Brenzett, Tenterden, and the bigger ones like Tangmere, and more sort of Kent Battle of Britain Museum, which was initially at Chilham Castle. And the idea was to conserve these items and exhibit them as a memorial, I suppose, in a way, or to bring home through this crashed, twisted metal, the violence of the past. So it's not forgotten. So it's an entirely honourable interest. Now, during 1940, because of the quantity of aircraft that were crashing, the recovery crews and maintenance units were absolutely overwhelmed. And there was a degree of subcontracting to civilian workers, and the whole system was overwhelmed, administratively, practically, and in every way. And of course, a lot of these aircraft crashed in remote areas, and they were difficult to find, and the sites were difficult to access. And of course, the digging equipment that was available back then is not as efficient and sophisticated and long reach as the equipment that we have today. So it was a difficult situation. So what happened was, inevitably, with this wave of interest in aviation archaeology, it was only going to be a question of time until a missing pilot was recovered. Now, when an aircraft crashes, it can penetrate some considerable distance into the ground, which is unsurprising when you think it could have crashed from 25,000, 30,000 feet. And around southern England, there's a lot of soft ground. Romney Marsh, Wickham Marshes near Canterbury, and so on. And these aircraft are going to go in deep. So a recovery crew turns up at the time, tidies up what's left on the surface, and leaves the rest, because at the end of the day, they don't know even what aircraft it is. They might know what type, but not what aircraft specifically. And of course, a battered old Merlin engine back then was of no intrinsic value whatsoever, no historic value. They needed practically functioning Merlin engines, not shattered units. So that's what happened. And very active was Mike Llewellyn, the late Mike Llewellyn, founder of the Kent Battle of Britain Museum, and an astonishing individual was Mike. And the Kent Battle of Britain Museum investigated an aircraft on the Wickham Marshes near Canterbury, and a dig took place in March 1971, at which the police were present. Now, there were substantial remains of the Spitfire found, the engine, propellers, etc., and indeed the pilot's parachute. And it was obvious that there were human remains there. In a single-seater fighter, the pilot sits on his parachute. So you're not going to find a parachute without a pilot. And according to Mike, the police were told about this at the time, but Mike and the Kent Battle of Britain Museum, they happily went off with the wreckage to display at the museum, which was then at Chilham Castle, and there was no follow-up. And this is the rub, because although there's obviously strict rules about the reporting of human remains discovered, on that occasion a coroner's officer was present in Kent Constabulary, and Mike's feeling was that the police had been told about it. It was down to them to get on with it, rightly so, and probably inform the RAF and the MOD. So that's where it was left. Now, nobody heard any more about that. Although the aircraft was identified, it was identified as a Spitfire 65 Squadron that was shot down on the 18th of August 1940, and it was actually flown by Flying Officer Franciszek Grushka, who was the first Polish Spitfire pilot to be killed in the Battle of Britain. So they knew whose aircraft it was, and it was exhibited as such. But there the matter lay for a while. 21st of May 1972, so this is a year later, Dave Buchanan and the Ashford and Tenterden group, they investigated what they thought was a Spitfire crash site at Goudhurst, also in Kent near Ashford, and it turned out to be a Hurricane. Very soft ground, very difficult digging conditions, and eventually substantial remains of the aircraft were found, and the pilot. And this time, the MOD was informed, and the police, and the procedure, the sort of discovery of human remains and so on, all of that kicked in. And it was ascertained to be a 20-year-old South African, George Drake, Pilot Officer George Drake, 607 Squadron from Tangmere, shot down and killed in action 9th of September 1940. The squadron had only just moved to Tangmere the previous day from Usworth up in the north of England, and they were completely overwhelmed on the night in their first combat, because the difference is the presence of the lethal Messerschmitt 109, which hacked apart these squadrons new to the battle, who had yet to adjust to the new tempo of combat. Extraordinary. And time again you see this. A new squadron number will appear in the casualty list, and bang, 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 3, 4, 5, 6 pilots sometimes wounded or killed. So that's what happened to poor young George Drake. And the authorities traced his two brothers in South Africa, who came over for his military funeral, which was at Brookwood. So that he was really the first of the missing few to be recovered, even though Franek Grushka had been the first to be discovered, arguably. So it goes on. 1973, there are two Messerschmitt 109 pilots recovered, Werner Nippel and Richard Radel, also in Kent. And so it's clearly becoming a problem. Now, there were no rules or regulations or law to govern this interest back then. And it must have been starting to cause the authorities in England increasing embarrassment and concern, which it was, because these things were obviously well publicised. And then at Chilham Castle, where Grushka's parachute is discovered, two former 65 Squadron Battle of Britain pilots, David Glazer and the Polish Gandhi Dravinsky, both of whom I knew, they alerted really the MOD that the parachute of Franek Grushka was displayed, and therefore his remains must be present at the site. So consequently, on the 15th of April 1974, there's an official RAF recovery at Wickenborough Marshes, during which Franek Grushka's human remains and personal effects were recovered. And I know Franek's niece, who lives not far from me, been friends for many years, who had the coins from his pocket and propelling pencil, which actually identified him because it was named to him. And then it really hits the fan. 1st of May 1975, the inquest begins in Canterbury, at which the police deny having been notified of the presence of human remains at the original recovery in 1971. So there's a big hoo-ha and a big row about this. Mike Llewellyn absolutely insists that the police did know, and the inference is that the police did nothing about it for whatever reason. So I don't know what went on, but suffice it to say that on the first, after the inquest finished, and it was, the verdict of the inquest was that Franek Grushka had lost his life in action, which was quite so. Grushka was laid to rest at the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Northwood, near Northolt, at a big ceremony. And bear in mind, Poland at this time, in 1975, is still behind the Iron Curtain and part of the Soviet bloc, which made communication with the West very difficult. And the Grushka family only discovered that Franek had been found when they heard a broadcast on the BBC World Service. It came as a big shock to them. Incredible. But it was a big funeral. It was a military funeral, well attended by the Polish community in London and the surrounding area. And there Franek Grushka joined various Polish Battle of Britain casualties from 303 Squadron, including the Czech Józef František, who was top scoring pilot. So it sort of closed the circle, and eventually Frank Grushka's niece Barbara came to live and study and work in England, and was able to visit the grave and bring her mother over, who was Frank's sister, and they were obviously deeply moved to actually stand by the grave. Interestingly, the grave is not a Polish headstone. It's a normal Commonwealth War Graves headstone, but it does say on it Polish forces. And the reason for that is because he was flying in an RAF squadron. And there were lots of Polish pilots embedded in RAF squadrons. It wasn't just those who flew with the specific Polish squadrons that were operational at the time. The fighter squadrons, 302 and 303 Squadron. And there was some movement recently to try and change the headstone to a Polish headstone design, but the family didn't want that because they felt that it acknowledged he was Polish, he was in an RAF unit, and therefore the headstone was perfectly appropriate and it should remain. And in fact, there's a note in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's files now that if there's ever any move to change that in the future, it's just not happening. So there we are. This is really just an introduction to the problem because it's still going on. And I wrote it all up in Missing in Action, Resting in Peace. It's not a sales plug, this is long sold out. But it was a chronology that working with a lot of the people who've been involved in these digs, Andy Saunders, Steve Vizard, Mark Kirby, David Buchanan, Mike Llewellyn, Dave Smith and others, that it sort of explained the chronology as to how all this, why it happened, what had happened, and how we got to where we were at that point with it all in 1998. And now we've obviously gone on further still, because at the time I'm recording this video, it's 2024. So it was quite an important book at the time, and actually very helpful to the Ministry of Defence Casualty section, because obviously these sections, they have a turnover of staff, they're not always familiar with the chronology of events and the narrative. So it was a good job that we did that. And more recently, for Battle of Britain Remembered, which is the 8th volume of the 8-volume official history, 1,000,000 words, I've recently completed for the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust and National Memorial to the Few. I've sort of given it an overview, again, because I think it's such an important subject. And the Grushka story I wrote up in more recently again, 2020, Battle of Britain 1940. It's just being reprinted in softback, actually. But the Grushka story is in there in detail. Pen and Sword, that one, my current publisher. But so what I thought we'd do, I thought we need to have conversations about this problem, about the missing. And I think that people don't necessarily understand it or are even aware of it. So I thought by doing this video, we would just introduce the subject, and over time, I'll add more videos to this particular thread about the missing. We'll look at some of these recoveries because they're really interesting. We'll look at some of the issues where there are, undoubtedly, there are still pilots out there. So we'll have a look at all this and get a conversation going. If you've got any comments, if you've got any feedback, please leave it in the comment section below. And if you like what we do, you're interested in the Battle of Britain, you want to join our community, please subscribe to the channel. It's all free. You watch all of these videos for nothing, and listen to the podcast. So there we are, an introduction to the missing few. And next time we'll start, no pun intended, digging a bit deeper. Thanks for listening.